Hi, I'm Casey Trasati, and this is my presentation for my thesis for the Behavior Analysis and Therapy program. My thesis is entitled The Effects of Verbal Operant Training and Response Interruption and Redirection on Vocal Stereotypy. Unfortunately, autism spectrum disorders are becoming more and more prevalent, therefore requiring more and more treatment for different characteristics. Autism is a spectrum disorder varying in intensity for different symptoms that can include and are not limited to repetitive speech, repetitive behaviors, lack of eye contact, a delay in speech, and a lack of social awareness. One of the key characteristics in autism spectrum disorder is called stereotypy. Stereotypy comes in two forms, motor and vocal. Motor stereotypy involves any movement of muscle, whereas vocal stereotypy includes vocalizations. Problems with stereotypic behaviors is they are typically, although not always, automatically reinforcing, therefore resistant to extinction. Automatic reinforcement means that the behavior reinforces the individual in some way. They do not need an external person or stimuli to reinforce themselves. Studies on stereotypy have focused on both motor and vocal. However, motor stereotypy studies are much more prevalent than vocal stereotypy studies. This is a problem because a lot of individuals diagnosed with autism either have motor and vocal, or just motor or just vocal. So there is a gap in the literature on treatments for vocal stereotypy. Interventions for stereotypy as a whole involve non-contingent music, differential reinforcement of other behaviors, also differential reinforcement of alternative behaviors. However, the success rate for all of these interventions is relatively low, if successful at all. Other studies on stereotypy involve an intervention called response interruption and redirection, or RIRD. RIRD is often done as a study alone, but some new current studies have done combination interventions with RIRD. Some of these interventions are verbal operant training, sertraline, or an SSRI, serotonin reuptake inhibitor, match stimulation, and a visual stimulus. The success rate of all of these combination interventions varies depending upon how they were implemented and which of these were done in combination with RIRD or alone and then with RIRD. The purpose of the current study was to combine elements of three other studies. The Colon et al. 2012 study did verbal operant training, specifically TACs. The Ahern et al. Study from 2007 is a widely cited study, and they did just the RIRD procedure alone. The Martinez et al. Study 2016 did a visual stimulus with RIRD. The Colon et al. Study was successful, however, there were several limitations. The verbal operant training was done first with tacting, and then RIRD was implemented once vocal stereotypy was not decreased to acceptably low levels. The Ahern et al. Study did the RIRD procedure with just vocal demands, and the withdrawal design that they did showed that when RIRD was removed, the behavior returned back to baseline levels. The Martinez et al. Study tried to bring RIRD into the natural environment with a big pink poster indicating when vocal stereotypy was not allowed. However, they were successful with the RIRD portion and did bring control into the natural environment for up to 30 minutes, but it was not sustainable. The participant for this study was a 9-year-old vocal verbal male who is an identical twin. He has autism spectrum disorder diagnosed at the age of 3, and he is currently placed in a special education classroom labeled STARS, specifically for individuals diagnosed with autism. He has two different types of problem behaviors, the first one being stereotypy, which has infiltrated every aspect of his life, and aggression. The aggression is related to the function of access denied. However, this was not being treated or looked at during this study. His current therapies include speech, NOT, and ABA, which he has been receiving since he was the age of 4. ABA he has been receiving since the age of 6. 3 different settings were examined: school, home, and community. At school, stereotypy was exhibited throughout the day, and this was the setting that was of the most interest to the researcher. The participant is currently in 3rd grade going into 4th grade. Unfortunately, in 5th grade, he will have to go to a different school unless he is able to get his vocal stereotypy down to clinically acceptable levels, because the school that he's supposed to be going to for junior high does not have a special education room for him to go. So he and his identical twin will be separated unless he is able to be in a mainstream classroom all day long with a paraprofessional. He is not able to do this unless he can get his vocal stereotypy down. His vocal stereotypy is loud, frequent, and often disrupts other people in his classroom. The home setting stereotypy was reported by his mother and witnessed by the researcher to start from the moment he woke up at roughly 5 a.m. every day and not stop until roughly he went to bed at 9:30 at night. In the community, he engages in vocal stereotypy at a continuous rate, therefore preventing him from interacting with peers or to engage in different activities and events he would otherwise enjoy. His vocal stereotypy was measured using partial interval recording for 15-minute sessions. The researcher was with the participant for 1 to 2 hours at a time, and 15-minute sessions were conducted with 30 intervals per session, and a 5-minute break was provided in between sessions so that they did not run together. During the 5-minute break, he was allowed to engage in vocal stereotypy, and on some occasions he did, and some occasions he didn't. It was very inconsistent. Partial interval recording did run into one problem of it overestimates the behavior, therefore duration was also taken to see how long during those 15-minute sessions he actually engaged in vocal stereotypy versus frequency. The definition for vocal stereotypy for the purpose of this study was any vocalization that was non-functional to time, place, or individual that he was supposed to be speaking to. We did not include motor stereotypy in this definition because he only engages in motor stereotypy while engaging in vocal stereotypy about 50% of the time. Otherwise, he does not engage in motor stereotypy. The experimental design was a multiple probe across settings design as outlined by Horner and Baer. This is different from a multiple baseline across settings in that it is allowed to be done when you cannot have a continuous measurement across all settings. Unfortunately, due to scheduling conflicts, the researcher was not able to conduct sessions in the proper manner for a multiple baseline design. Therefore, the multiple probe design was done. Baseline probes before intervention were done in every setting except for community when it was not practical and the intervention needed to be implemented in the community due to such high clinical rates of 100% duration and frequency. The procedures involved doing RIRD in the natural environment only. Previous studies have lacked this type of intervention outside of the Martinez et al. Study in 2016, so it was deemed necessary to bring RIRD from the table to the individual's natural environment. The 15-minute sessions did take place in the natural environment, not during intensive teaching trials with verbal operant training. A stimulus card that was 3 by 5 inches tall was made with one red side and one green side, indicating when to stop and when to go for vocal stereotypy. The red side was the stop, the green was the go. RIRD involved 3 demands, which was a mix of vocal and motor, and when the participant did not stop engaging in vocal stereotypy when he was told he was on red and engaged in vocal stereotypy throughout all 3 demands, it was repeated. So the requirements to stop RIRD was he must stop engaging in vocal stereotypy before the first demand was put in place. If he continued to engage in it before the first demand was put in place, another round of 3 was done until he stopped engaging in the behavior. In order to assess which verbal operant would be appropriate for this participant, the ABLES-R was conducted by, ABLES-R was developed by Partington in 2010. He was assessed through all the verbal operants, mainly visual performance, receptive language, motor imitation, tacting, and intraverbals. Echoics were not tested because of the participants' vocal abilities, it would have been a waste of the researcher's time to test the echoics on him. His intraverbal score was the only one that was really looked at because everything else was at 100% mastery. His intraverbal score, however, was at 44% mastery. The Abels-R pretest was very important because in the Colon et al. Study that this thesis attempted to further, did not do a preliminary pretest or assessment to decide which verbal operant would be pertinent to teach. They picked tax. The researcher for this study wanted to make sure that there was evidence to support the verbal operant that was chosen. A functional assessment was also done, as you can see on the graphs here, an indirect QABF and a direct observation of 1 hour in each setting was done, and for the direct observation, each hour was calculated and put into the graph here. So the graph that says percentage of occurrences of vocal stereotypy is for all settings together. The QABF showed 3 functions, or 3 possible functions. The first one would be escape from a demand in the natural environment, as RID was done in the natural environment. A non-social function, so automatic reinforcement, and physical. It is important to note that at the time of this study, the participant did have an ear infection, so the physical or the pain attenuation, the researcher did believe would go down for the QABF. During the direct assessment, the participant engaged in vocal stereotypy in all conditions. The demand was the lowest because during the demand condition, he was expected to answer interverbal questions, tacting questions, and encouraged to mand and answer listener responses and motor imitation. Therefore, he was busy engaging other verbal behavior, not just vocal stereotypy at the time. It is important to note that when given the option to remain alone by himself or receive an electronic, there were 2 situations which he decided to stay alone by himself, and he scripted or he engaged in vocal stereotypy consisting of movies, statements heard out from his leap pad, and statements heard from an app called Talking Tom. RARD was done in the traditional manner with the 3 demands with motor and vocal, not just one or the other. When RID was repeated was when he did not stop engaging in vocal stereotypy after the first demand, and the red-green scripting card was brought everywhere and made available to him to see. So when he was in the natural environment with the instructor, whether it be school, home, or community, the card was held so that he could see it no matter where he was. The goal of that was to pair the red-green scripting card with punishment so that RID could be transferred to the natural environment in a much more natural way, as it is more socially acceptable to hand a child a card rather than make them do 3 motor imitations or answer 3 questions in order to stop engaging in problem behavior. Verbal operant training was done through intensive teaching trials. Targets were chosen after the Abels pretest was conducted, and where he landed within the Abels pretest decided which targets that should be run. So he landed around age 30, and according to Partington 2010 for the Abels-R, that is rotating WH questions of who, what, where, when. He also landed in age 31, which was which questions, and age 32, which were how questions. So those were the interverbals that were focused on. Errorless learning was conducted when he failed a target in baseline. Baseline consisted of asking the participant the question 3 different times, and if he missed it 3 different times, it was considered a target that needed to be taught. Errorless learning involved asking the participant the question, either providing him with a vocal response or visual stimuli, removing the visual stimuli, and then doing the transfer trial and asking him again, 3 to 4 distractors, and then the probe at the end. He was never prompted at the end, as this participant is a known quick learner. Therefore, the probe was not necessary, or therefore prompting for the probe was not necessary. Error correction was done in a similar manner to errorless learning. However, if the participant received a plus or an independent mark on the daily data sheet for that particular target, it was instantly probed. If he erred on that probe, we went through and did the prompt, transfer trial, distractor, probe to see if he had learned, if independence had been gained for that particular target. He was on a variable ratio of 8 and had a token board, so on an average of 8 responses, he would receive a token, varying from a requirement of 3 tokens up to 15 tokens needed, and the number of tokens required never went backwards. So once he reached 15 tokens required on his token board, he would not go backwards to say like 3 or 5 tokens required in order to receive terminal reinforcement. The Abels-R post-test was assessed in the similar manner of the Abels-R pre-test. Visual performance, receptive language, motor interpretation, tactic, and interverbals were done. The interverbal score at the end of the Abels-R post-test was 74%. Since the other areas were at 100%, they were just checked for maintenance very briefly, and all remained very high. His interverbal score did improve 30%, including some novel areas that had not previously been taught. So, the results are shown here in the multiple probe design. As you can see, the intervention was done in school first, then it was done in home, and then it was done in the community. School has an upward trend, very little variation as it is continuing to go up. There's a little variation and a small extinction burst within the school setting around session 29, 31, and 33. However, after that, as long as RID was in place, you can see in the last 4 probes that the duration was under 1 minute and the frequency was under 10%. The home intervention was variable within the baseline, therefore baseline probes were done immediately prior to the intervention, and he remained at or near 0 levels in the home. For community, we have a lot of variation in the beginning, but then we have 4 straight probes at 100% frequency for 15 minutes and 15-minute duration, so 100% in both areas being measured. It is also important to note in the community there was a very large extinction burst related to some problem behavior not related to the study. So this is just a close-up picture of what school ended up looking like. The solid line indicates when the intervention was put in place. Here's home, and as you can see, it remained at or near 0 levels. Community, once the extinction burst was done, remained at or near 0 levels. It was slightly higher, but it still is really relatively close to acceptable clinical levels. This is the Abels-R grid provided by Partington. It demonstrates each one of these are a task, and the light gray is the pre-test, the dark gray is the post-test. He increased from 44 to 74%. That 30% increase is shown in the dark gray areas. And as you can see, we focused mainly on the age 30, 31, and 33, and 32, excuse me. And as you can see, he even achieved a few levels higher. So the purpose of the study was to decrease vocal stereotypy in a 9-year-old vocal verbal male who needs to be able to be placed in a mainstream classroom in order to attend the same school as his identical twin brother by the time he is in 5th grade. The deficits in the literature indicated that response interruption and redirection is highly effective for vocal stereotypy, however is rarely brought into the natural environment and is rarely tested across settings. The combination interventions of RIRD, interverbal training, and the stimuli helped bring RIRD into the natural environment, increase appropriate vocalizations, and transfer control from RIRD to the stimuli, which is much more functional for the parents to be able to do well in the community and other natural environment settings. It severely decreased vocal stereotypy, therefore furthering the research. However, one of the limitations was not being able to do another baseline probe within the community setting. There was no withdrawal to show the effectiveness of a single intervention. Also, when looking at the graph, control was demonstrated that the behavior did not decrease in any of the settings until the intervention was put in place. However, it also demonstrates a limitation of RARD and that it needs to be taught across multiple settings in order to be effective. Therefore, there is a failure for RARD to generalize. Also, this was done for one participant, which makes the researcher unaware of effectiveness for other individuals. The participants in the peers' classroom were rather disruptive and may have contributed to the spike in behavior during the intervention phase of the community, as those were the same peers that were available within the community. Here are some references of studies that have been done on vocal and motor stereotypy. Thank you for your time, and I appreciate you taking the time to listen.